happening here tonight?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little skit you're doing, which we're all going to do.
Excited about it.
Yeah! You don't know me, I'm Richard Biever, the Artistic Director of Fuse Productions. We're so thrilled to have these folks here to talk a little bit about history of musical theater, particularly the Golden Age, and what's happening now, and can we call it a new Golden Age? Let me introduce our panelists. Right here on our left, Peter Filichia, right? Yeah. New York-based theater critic, so be careful, who's been, Rich Rollins has been reviewed by him, this guy right here, you reviewed him.
Is that true?
That's true. It was positive, it was
It
positive.
was good. I think it was it Fall Days? I can't remember.
Fall
It's where? 2001.
Really?
Yeah.
The one with Alaska? And I said something good about it?
About him.
Over my head.
We may have, let's get along. It's better, you know. Oh, I loved it.
You have two columns, Masterworks Broadway and Switzerland, still true, right? I think all this is up to date. Writes regular entries for the Music Theater International marquee blog. You wrote a regular column, the diary for the website Theater Mania from 2001 to 2011. And the for the website Broadway Online, which was not existing. He has 1 million books. Let's Put On a Musical. Broadway musicals, the biggest hit and the biggest flop of the season, 1959 to 2000. Yeah. Strippers, Showgirls, and Sharks. A very opinionated history of the Broadway musicals that did not win the Tony Award. Can you give us a couple of examples of shows that did not win the Tony Award?
Well, I didn't name the book that. My editor did. But Strippers refers to Gypsy, which didn't win. Showgirls refers to Follies, which didn't win. And Sharks is West Side Story, which didn't win either. So those are three. That's why it's called that.
And your most recent,
I'm sorry? 2 Tits, yeah.
most recent book, The Great Parade, Broadway's astonishing, never to be forgotten 63-64 season, which Scott and I both take credit for because I was born in 63 and he was born in 64, so that's why that great season happened. Yes, and you've written the liner notes for many Broadway cast albums, including Jesus Christ Superstar, Fade Out, Fade In, and is the critic in residence for the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music. In the middle, Jennifer Ashley Tepper, producer, author, musical theater historian, dreamer, and doer. And that is the truth.
That's my Twitter bio.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I go everywhere to get this stuff. She assisted on the Broadway production of Title of Show and worked with Tony-nominated director Michael Greif, who directed Next to Normal, Rent, and Grey Gardens, among other things. Worked for producer Ken Davenport. She is the author of 2 volumes of The Untold Stories of Broadway, featuring countless interviews from artists in the professional world of theater. Picks those up, they're both fantastic. And she's prolific on social media, which is great because we all get a peek into the industry through her tweets and entries. Thanks for being here too. And last but certainly not least, Scott Miller. He's been directing musicals since 1981 and founded the New Line Theater in St. Louis in 1991. He's written the book Music and Lyrics for 9 musicals and written 2 non-musical plays. His 2006 musical, Johnny Appleweed, was nominated for 4 Kevin Kline Awards. He was honored in 2014 with the St. Louis Theater Circle Award for his body of work with New Line. And American Theater Magazine wrote, Miller is in his quietly ornery Midwestern way. He's not ornery at all, that's what's so funny. Advancing and reifying the American musical theater form as it has come kicking and screaming into the 21st century. So it makes it kind of perfect to be on this panel. He's written many books that I'm a huge admirer of. From Assassins to West Side Story, Deconstructing Harold Hill, Rebels with Applause, and this might be of interest, Let the Sunshine In, The Genius of Hair, among others, and music theater history books as well. You also have a podcast, Stage Rock, available on iTunes, so you can connect up with these folks. All right, let's talk talking. Golden Age. The first, what we all kind of refer to as the Golden Age. What are we talking about? Where do you start? Where's it end? Whatever our way works. Here.
Being the eldest.
Right.
I asked Scott earlier what he would go back in the time machine and see. He said, Follies. I was there. You want to be there to see the big shows from way back when? You got to be old. I wish I was 10 or 20 years older, frankly, but that's another story. Yeah, what I usually hear is 1943 when Oklahoma started to 1964 when Fiddler opened. But I think it's a little before and after, because I would say that considering that Pal Joey started, by the way, Scott has a cat named Pal Joey. Considering that Pal Joey happened in 1940 and suddenly the musical theater was growing up a bit, because this was a pretty sordid story for 1940 about a gigolo who was hooking up with a society lady. In 1941, Lady in the Dark, which was a very experimental show, in which a lot of dialogue and then a song sequence and then back to dialogue, like they were taking turns. So those are two significant shows. It's enough for me to say that it started in 1940. I would go much later than 64, though, because to me, Cabaret is a seminal show. I was on the ground floor at Cabaret. I even invested money in it way back in 1967, 66 actually, and it won the Tonys. But this was such a significant show because it was the missing link between the traditional Broadway musical and the concept musical. There's a little of both in there, so that was significant. But, you know, I really believe the Golden Age started coming to an end when, in the early 70s, when Life magazine went out of business and when the Ed Sullivan Show went off TV, because Life magazine used to treat Broadway very, very well. It would put shows on its cover. It was rarely an issue where there wasn't some reference to musical theater, usually musicals, but sometimes plays too. But it was your cultural imperative to know what was going on Broadway. You were an unsophisticated person if you did not know. There was no excuse for it. Even if you didn't get to New York, it was your responsibility. And the Ed Sullivan Show did that too, because they often had many sequences for musicals on shows. Usually, to be frank, when the shows needed to do business. The hits were rarely on Ed Sullivan because they didn't need the exposure. You would see the hits 3 or 4 years into the run, but now they needed to sell tickets, and that's what happened. But when those two things went off the air, suddenly Broadway was really took a terrible hit because it just wasn't as famous to the average person as it was before then. So that's the beginning, but I will still go as far as 1981 because the 70s we had those wonderful Sondheim shows, Company, Follies, Little Night Music, Pacific Overtures, and Sweeney Todd. I think that's still a golden age. I say 81 because that was Dreamgirls, and that was a significant show. Michael Bennett's last show, as it turned out to be, but more to the point, the 80s really got really bad, and bad shows were getting nominated, and they were eliminating categories one year, that type of thing. So I think the golden age was a little longer than a lot of people give it credit for.
One thing that's interesting that we were talking about this, you know, Broadway was in magazines and Broadway was on TV more, and part of the golden age ending was that ending. And the fact that, you know, one of the main reasons I think we're in a new golden age is because the internet has allowed so much of America to see musical theater, and there's also, you know, things like the live musicals on TV and more movie musicals being made, and musical theater in general getting airtime on TV shows, like, you know, musical theater on sitcoms. There's all of these things, but especially YouTube, especially the internet, allowing Broadway fans to talk to each other across the globe, that have made it a thing that is available to everybody. It's at everybody's fingertips. You don't have to be in New York in the same way that maybe the Ed Sullivan Show and magazines reached people in the last golden age. So that's a big part of, I think, why we're seeing a resurgence of musical theater and pop culture, that it can reach us.
Well, in fact,
It's accessible.
what was interesting about that, as mentioned, Len, that I go to the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and I am told that so many kids audition with songs that don't have original cast album, that they find them on YouTube.
Totally.
That's really become a thing. Who would think that they would discover songs there? But it really does happen.
It's YouTube, I call it the new Tin Pan Alley. But I run a venue in New York called 54 Below. I do all the programming there, and it's very often that a writer will say, oh, we did a show here, 140 people saw it here, we put it on YouTube, it has 20,000 hits, I've sold hundreds of copies of my sheet music, and it's giving me this new perspective on, like, musical theater is reaching people who are nowhere near New York, who maybe have never been to New York, who are performing that song song because there's a little video that someone filmed in a basement. So it's changed the game for sure.
And how's that changed? That's changed for the music theater writers especially, I would say. Because it's so hard to get a show produced. But it's very easy to put your song on YouTube and get attention that way.
There's like all the apocryphal but also true stories of like Barbara Streisand being discovered down in the Village at a club or something like that. But there are stories. I produced a concert years ago where Krista Rodriguez, who's like a Broadway actress, sang a song by my writer collaborator friend Joe Iconis. And the creators, the showrunners and executive producers of Smash saw that YouTube video and said, we want this to be on television. And that's how that song was like the opening number of Act 2 of an NBC show where, millions of people saw it. And that happened from a YouTube video. So YouTube is the new club.
Would title of show have gone to Broadway without the web series that it had?
Yeah, probably not. And that's, when I was working on Title of Show, we said, let's put a web series online so people feel invested in the story of whether we're going to Broadway or not, and we'll kind of show the journey. But when we were making that web series, it was, we hope this will go to Broadway. And then as the momentum picked up, it really ended up happening. But it was definitely part of it.
I think so.
So the internet also gives people an investment in things. You can watch videos for months before a show comes to Broadway. Look at Waitress, which is happening right now. All these people have been following it for months because of the music and the videos and they know who Sarah Bareilles is and the internet. And it's created an investment for people before shows start in a way that I think they used to have when they would read, the literature when it existed in the 60s.
Do you have any thought about beginning and end of what we call now the first golden age?
I would say 1943 to 1969, and I love the Sondheim musicals equally. But I feel like the golden age, the last golden age, had this intersection of musicals were finally integrated. It coincided with what people were paying attention to in pop culture. And also musicals were about things that musicals could never be about before. And I think that those three things converged for those 1943 to 69. And once you hit the Sondheim, unfortunately, I don't think everyone was going around talking about Little 97, even though I wish they were. And I feel like those are the things we're starting to see converge again that, clarify this.
69 being what show?
This one.
I have a feeling, but I was wondering.
Yeah, but the Hair, 1776, I feel like when 69 hit, and we all know about how America changed at that time, and people were listening to rock music, and theater, the kind of music people were hearing in the theater was not matching what they were listening to on the radio to it split off. And it's only now that it's starting to come back together fully, although there have certainly been exceptions all along the way.
Cool. Scott, what's your thought about our previous golden age?
I don't think the previous golden age was a golden age. I'm contrary. So,
I love that we all
I said it! I think
You're wondering.
I am wondering. See, that's why.
Yeah.
I think the Rodgers Hammerstein era was the Rodgers Hammerstein era. I think they moved us considerably forward. I don't think it was particularly more wonderful than what came before or after. I think the whole history is pretty wonderful, except the 80s. But I think, but part of it is I've read so many history books and all that talk about the art form as if the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical is the pinnacle of the art form. I don't think it is. I think stuff right now is the pinnacle of the art form. I think, my opinion and your opinion, I think we're in a golden age now that started in the mid-late 90s with Rent, Noise Funk, Violet, Floyd Collins, Bad Boy, You're in Town, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we're still in the middle of it. Cool. And I think part of that is there was a moment, and I think it was in the early mid-90s, when people started writing musicals not because it would be on Broadway, but because they had to write a musical. And those became a lot more personal and a lot quirkier and a lot more rule-breaking. And I think that changed the art form in a big way, and I think it moved us forward. I think it was something really kind of new and cool.
Well, one thing about saying 1943 Oklahoma is it ignores George M. Cohan. It ignores
Showboat.
And then it ignores the musicals of the 1930s, many of which were groundbreaking.
But it's amazing to me that the lessons of Showboat didn't take right away.
That's right.
That's right.
Do you think that's the Depression?
Well, even in the 2 years before the Depression, I would think, because those days shows going on fast. you don't see anything in 28, or even, don't forget the Depression 29 was not until October. So,
Right.
so there was still some time there. But nobody seemed to learn the lessons of Showboat. It took a long time before that happened, and I'm very surprised that it did. But not that Showboat was perfect, but certainly, yeah. I mean, Showboat has one of the most amazing things ever when Julie is singing "Can't Help Loving That Man," and she is suspected of being black because that's a black song. What a subtle way of getting that point across. That's marvelous. It'd be a long time before we had anything as good as that. So, but, you know, your point's as well taken about the Depression. Shows in the 30s had to be a little mindless to get us out of that, and yet, go ahead.
But I think how Joey also did a bunch of things that didn't get immediately imitated.
Sure.
Until it came back.
Sure, yeah. It took 12 years before Pal Joey really became a title. I mean, it is a myth that Pal Joey was this terrible failure back in 1940. It ran almost 400 performances, which, believe me, in those days was a run. I mean, shows didn't run that long back then. So under partly because the tourism in New York wasn't that strong, and probably because there were fewer people. I mean, now we have so much more population. The theaters are basically the same size, so that's why shows run substantially longer. But yeah, it is true that the lesson of Pal Joey took a while too, and I'm sure it's because Brooks Atkinson, the critic of the Times, famously said, "Can you draw sweet water from a foul well?" He was really, and then 12 years later, when he came back, he changed his tune.
I think also, though, in musical theater, we have these hits, and then you have these cultural phenomenons, and the cultural phenomenons get all of the credit for making all of those
Exactly.
innovations. And really, it's, I mean, I don't want to put down Showboat, because I actually would consider that a cultural phenomenon, but Oklahoma came along, and it was like the thing everyone in town was talking about, and it was the Hamilton of its time, as everyone will say about every other show that was a phenomenon right now. But like, there were shows that used rock music before Hair, as we all know, and it took Hair to be Hair to explode it open. So I feel like that happens, and it's always disappointing for the people who know the things that, it's like, you know, the concept musicals that came before the first concept musical. Or,
Lady in the Dark.
exactly.
It does take a while, otherwise, to, you know, the real innovators never get credit, and the imitators of the innovators somehow do.
You guys should all see Shuffle Along if you go to New York. I've been talking about Shuffle Along all day.
I'm sure you drove out with me, and I heard a lot about
Give your elevator pitch about Shuffle Along.
It's playing at the Music Box right now. That's a terrible opening line, because why does that sell it to you at all? It's a great theater. You've never seen, right? You've never seen musicals there. It's very intimate. But it's a musical about this musical called Shuffle Along that came along in 1921 and changed Broadway and changed pop culture, changed New York. It was the first black hit musical. It was written by black writers. It had black stars. It had syncopation. It had tap dancing. It was integrated in a way musicals weren't. And it's completely forgotten, and everyone that did it is completely forgotten. But everyone who was completely inspired by it, we know all of their names today. So it was this like forgotten piece of history, and the musical that's playing right now is literally uses the songs from the 1921 show. So you're seeing Shuffle Along. You're seeing the story of how Shuffle Along was made with all of those creators, and you're also seeing this incredible story about how like black art has been reappropriated in America. I mean, it's like, I've seen it twice and I haven't stopped talking about it all day. So, and now I'll stop. I'll stop now.
But I want to take an issue with something Scott said, or maybe I'm not taking an issue. I want to know what you mean by rule breaking, because I think one of the rules that's been broken has been unfortunate for musical theater, and that's the lack of rhyme. Now, you may not agree with this, but I will tell you that, both that we don't. Yeah, I think rhyme is important. Now, here's Spring Awakening, a few years ago, opening to rave reviews and opening to Tony Awards, getting more Tony Awards than anybody else, winning Best Musical. Of the 111 weeks that show ran on Broadway, it sold out 3 weeks. Now you might say, no, it was a tough subject matter. And it was, I'll grant you that, but a lot of shows that have serious nature seem to do better than this. Why didn't it? Because I counted 59 false rhymes in the show. And the thing is, I really believe that when an audience is sitting there and you don't give them rhymes, they have a hard time hearing and understanding what's being said. The rhymes help you to understand the words. It's hard sometimes to get in the theater where people are singing, especially when it's an ensemble, and as a result, the rhymes help you along. And I think every time there's a false rhyme or a false accent on a rhyme, it chips away a little bit of the enjoyment, a little bit. By the time you leave the theater, you're saying, it was all right. And I think the word of mouth on Spring Awakening couldn't have been that good if indeed it wasn't selling out for any length of time. And this happened too with the revival. Again, rave reviews. I expect very nice reception at the Tony Awards. But again, it never did business. There was never a week this time around that it ever sold out. And I can't say that I can 100% say for certain I'm right about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if I am, that rhyme is one of the reasons why. But you don't feel it's important.
Counterpoint. I think one of the things that's cool about this period right now is that finally rock and roll is the default language of the Broadway musical,
It has to
of
be.
musical theater.
It has to
Tom Kitt made a really interesting point to me that once upon a time, rock musicals were about the rock music.
Right.
Superstar Evita, it's
Right.
because it's rock and roll that it's interesting, right? And now it's just the common language
It
of
has to
writers and
be,
audience.
because of-
And so I think part of that is all of us who grew up with rock and roll do not require perfect rhymes. It does not even jar me a second to hear a cheap rhyme.
No, I understand that. However, we're talking about two different things. If we're talking about listening to a record, listening to something on the radio, you hear over and over.
No, I'm not
and
talking
over
about seeing a
again.
show live.
But I'm talking about live shows. I think it hurts the audience when it kind of. I saw somebody nodding here. Do you agree with this? Was that you?
Yes.
Yeah, you're on the spot now, man.
I think it's really interesting that rock is the default thing now, but no matter what the music style is, the story has to be told, the lyrics have to be intelligible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So-
Absolutely.
So do
I just don't think perfect rhyme has anything to do with it anymore.
Yeah, fine. And we can certainly agree to disagree, and I'm sure we will as time goes on. But nevertheless, watching Dear Evan Hansen the other night, a new musical, out came the mother singing in a rock Yankee. She has to. She's a young woman. She's in her 30s, maybe 40 at the most, and she has to sing that way because she kind of sounds like Wilbur Evans in By the Beautiful Sea. I mean, you know, it
Everybody gets on their phone to Google that.
Yeah, like, by the beautiful city.
At your peril. You won't be happy when you hear any of Wilbur Evans' songs in By the Beautiful Sea. Anyway, you know, it has to be. It just has to be. The one thing I would like, I prefer shows in a period to sound like they're in that period. So the Spring Awakening score jarred me. If the Spring Awakening was set now, I would like the music much better because that's not what the kids in Germany in 1890 sounded like. But I understand that we have a people who grew up on rock and roll, as you say, and that's rock is called. You know, I'm surprised you said rock and roll. You're digging. So.
I do a lot of period shows.
So anyway, but all things considered, I really do believe that a period show should sound like a period. And people say to me, but you love Pippin so much, but we don't know what music sounded like back then. You know, I mean, you know, so as a result, but you know, I sort of have a feeling, you know, what music should sound like in 1910, 1920, 1930. And so as a result, I'd like it to sound that way. I think it's more authentic.
So can I ask,
Of
in
course.
19th century New England, did they sing in Rodgers and Hammerstein foxtrots?
I think, frankly, I do think the Rodgers and Hammerstein music sounds right. Now, it may just be because I grew up with it and I was used to it, and I learned those shows very, very quickly when I got interested, and that was the lingua franca of the day, so to speak, and that could very well be the case. And you know, I was thinking of my son when I used to take him to movies when he was a little boy, and you know, he accepted everything. You know, that was it. You know, there was no criticism, and then little by little he was saying, "Gee, that line was said because they wanted us to know that information, not because that would say that to the other person." And I thought that was really good that he was, you know, catching on. So it's possible that I was just accepting what was given to me, and these were the giants of musical theater, and they knew better than I, and I just accepted it. I'll grant you that, but to me, still to this day, Carousel sounds more in period than Spring Awakening did to me.
We're being videotaped, right?
We are.
This
We
is
are.
all on the record. I'm not gonna say the next one.
Well, you'd put it out there anyway. I don't think we said anything.
Well, we're just going to put it on YouTube because he wants.
That's right.
Which is why you should always ask. No, I was gonna say, I mean, without naming any names of musicals I don't like, so I think there's something really, I agree with you, there are musicals that, there are two Wild Parties. One is written by Michael John LaChiusa, and one is by Andrew Litva, and I much prefer the one that sounds like it is for that age. So I agree with you that sometimes that is a lot more effective, but at the same time, it's really moving to me to see people who are, of a new generation who kind of would not understand Alexander Hamilton's story if it wasn't being told in the musical idioms it's being told in, and those musical idioms being of today tell us all of the things we have in common with these people that we'll never know that lived hundreds of years before us, in the same way that when I talk to teenagers who saw Spring Awakening, they understand 1890s Germany because it's delivered to them in the music that they understand. So I feel like there's that dichotomy that we can create in theater that is sometimes really powerful, and when people do it not purposefully, it is very angering to me, and I'm like, why doesn't this sound like what the Wild Party should sound like? I'm sorry, Andrew Litva, I'm sorry. But that's
Interestingly enough, in terms of that, when I was watching Hamilton for the first time, and there was rap music, I noticed two things. One, it's a little slower than what I hear blaring out of car radios when I'm walking down the street, and I think that's very smart. The other thing is, it fits because rap is inherently angry, and this was an angry time in America. So as a result, I think it works very well under those circumstances.
I did live as Wild Party.
Sorry.
And part of what I
Which,
loved
by the way, I
about
listened to yesterday, ironically.
I don't hate it, I just mean that in that story, I prefer the one that mentions.
well, so through circumstances that I will not regurgitate, I ended up playing the shows, which it is a hard score to play. But part of what I loved about it was that it was a little period. It was jazz and kind of dipped in that, and it also dipped into rock and roll. And I think what was cool for me was this was a show set in the 20s, right? But it was also absolutely about right now. And I think those two musical languages were this really cool way of telling us that this is then and it's now both.
Yeah.
Another thing I would say about Wild Party that I really liked, I think we were very lucky to get two different artists working.
Exactly.
That
Amazing thing.
Yeah, I think that should happen more often. I know it's not commercially viable to have it happen more often.
They probably don't like it.
Yeah, I understand that, but from a consumer vantage point, to see how one artist would treat something and another one would.
That's my favorite idea for a reality show, lock musical theater writers in the house and they're all writing the same music.
That's gonna happen.
That's gonna happen.
That's so awesome.
She will make that happen.
If Smash couldn't get the ratings.
Yeah. I like that we've diverted from the golden age.
Well, no, because the next question was about convention, and we kind of started to talk about this, lyrics and how things are changing. But if you talk about conventions of the golden age, what we're calling the Rodgers and Hammerstein through the 60s, what are the conventions of that time period that what we all would think of as defining that time?
The Dream Ballet.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that certainly is one, and that one certainly outwore its welcome.
Fairly quickly, actually.
The secondary comic couple.
Yep.
Yeah.
Secondary time.
I think that, I agree that there's so much great stuff that happened before 1943, but I think why you can't switch songs out. Like from 1943 to 65, you can't put a song from Fiddler into Funny Girl. And I find that even the best musicals from pre-1943, you could kind of do that.
Right.
So whatever,
We know this because
right, whatever
a number
music
of
it is.
Gershwin musicals are being written now.
Right.
And incorporate those songs into the
Right, and you know that whenever it happens, some critic's going to say, who could ask for anything? Always the default line when there's a new Gershwin.
Yeah.
But I would also say, people could say we're in love, could go in any Rodgers and Hammerstein show, it's on a Saturday evening, you go in
You
any
really
Rodgers and
don't like
Hammerstein show. I used to, I'm just kind of over them.
Kind of.
And yet, Scott, that may very well be a minority opinion because.
Why do you do this?
Yeah.
Well, I talked to Denny Rick, who runs the Muni in St. Louis. We have this massive outdoor theater called the Muni.
Massive.
10,000 seats.
10,000 seats.
Leave before the final number, you'll never get out.
Yeah, it's in Forest Park, and the
I didn't
traffic's
see
awful.
anal lice, I didn't see fire.
I hated that when I was a semester out there. So one time I was talking to Denny Rick, who runs the Muni, and I was out there to see a show. I think it was Seussical. And I came up to him and I said, Denny, I love there's no Rodgers and Hammerstein in the season anywhere. And he laughed. He said, yeah, well, the box office doesn't love it.
You bet it does.
And I was like, really? He goes, nothing sells as well as Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Yeah, so there must be something to that, Scott. I mean, King and I is still doing well, and South Pacific did well on Broadway, so people still want to see these shows.
So my objection is that Rodgers and Hammerstein shows don't know about the sexual revolution, Vietnam, Watergate, et cetera, and I feel like they don't really apply to our world much anymore.
I don't see see why that's important, because what I love about theater, I never use the term dated, oh, that's dated. I view these things as time machines. I love going back and seeing what people were thinking at that moment in time. That tells me a lot about what America was or another foreign country. The show is a foreign import. That interests me tremendously. It doesn't have to be relevant to my life now. I want to know what goes before it. To me, they're history lessons, and I find that very interesting.
Aren't they kind of mythic stories? I mean, they translate, they're viewed differently every time they're revised.
They are.
So, I mean, I read somebody's review of the current production of The King, and I said, wow, this seems so relevant given our national discussion about immigration. And, so, and who would have thought that about The King?
Sure.
You're sure. But depending on what's going on, it can speak to you in a different way. It
Most
must,
things-
or why would people keep buying the ticket?
So here's my last anti-RNA argument.
We'll see.
I'm gonna really try. I think what's missing in RNA shows, which is why I am not interested anymore, is irony and cynicism. And I think those are both in all the shows from 65 on. And I think for me personally, I don't like a show that doesn't acknowledge that. It doesn't have that edge.
Allegro?
No.
Allegro's my favorite Bars and Hammerstein show.
I can understand that.
Yeah,
I really
well,
do.
it's definitely, I find it to be the most challenging one, and also I think it does touch on that irony and cynicism, and I think that when they didn't find themselves having huge success with that, they thought what we do best is this classic larger-than-life story of mythical proportions and all of the things that they do.
Real sincerity.
Right, and no sincerity, and I think that they went, oh, this experimental thing that like if Allegro had been a smash, their next thing might have been more conceptual and
Right.
that had gone in that direction. And I think they were commenting on like the ills of modern society with that show, if you know it at all. So I feel like that set them in a direction that, and then also if Hammerstein hadn't died at the time he did, 1960 hit and things changed a little bit, maybe they would have changed with that. Maybe they wouldn't have it.
Because when you think of it, Rogers and Hammerstein did change, because they had both been working long before they got together. So.
If you think about Richard Rogers,
bigger.
Yeah.
well, with Richard Rogers with Lawrence Hart, I would say there's cynicism. I would say
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
a cynical view of the world.
Yeah.
That's in Lawrence's Hart.
And irony.
World
Lots of irony.
Oh, yeah, Joey.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, very true. But, the thing about the timing, of course, brings up Chicago, which has been wildly successful, and everybody talked about the fact that it was the O.J. Simpson trial that really made that happen. Believe me when I tell you, the production of Chicago that opened in 1996 cannot hold a candle to what it looked like in 1975, which was a really stunning production. It's really very much like a 12th photocopy.
And he lost the vaudeville metaphor.
Yeah, it really did.
In black and white.
So, but again, the timing, as you say, that's very valid, so sometimes things do speak to us later.
Well, Chicago, the original production opened the same year as Porcelain, and everything was drowned out by
No
Porcelain.
question.
But Chicago still ran almost 1,000 performances,
Right.
which is nothing to sneeze at.
You bet.
So it's interesting that it really was successful.
Absolutely.
It just didn't get the
Right.
press that
Right.
Porcelain was good.
I think also I just want to say about RNH and both Golden Ages is that I think that they were writing for the first time about types of people that hadn't been written about, and the way that they tried to portray racism on a Broadway stage, and the way that they told you the stories of Asian characters, like those hadn't been told in the way that they were being told very seriously. And I think that what's interesting about the new Golden Age we find ourselves in, and I think Rogers and Hammerstein were like humanitarians, and I don't mean to put them down, they happen to be white men. And our new Golden Age has Asian artists writing about Asian stories, and women writing about women's stories, and black artists writing about black stories, and gay people writing about gay people's stories. And it's like this convergence of all of these types of people that never told their own stories, and I think that's part of it. But I think that was also part of the last Golden Age. It just didn't happen to be the people who those applied to writing them. It was people trying to tell those stories.
Well, in fact, about not being relevant as far as that's concerned, I have a feeling there are still people today who hear carefully taught for the first time who go into that theater more racist than they are when they come out.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
I get that it's not ironic, but it does have a message that is relevant. Sondheim once asked Hammerstein. Sondheim was was taught by Oscar Hammerstein, and he once asked Oscar, "Why don't you write a sophisticated musical?" And Oscar Hammerstein said, "What, do you mean one set in the New York penthouse?" And Sondheim said, "Well, yeah, that's what you mean." He goes, "Because it doesn't interest me." And I think this is what you're feeling about those shows. The things that interest you are not being discussed in those shows.
want my shows,
perfectly legitimate.
I want my shows to be about what's going on in the world right now, whether or not they're set right now.
Mhm.
And there are a lot that do that.
But I mean, carousel's about spousal abuse. That's really one of them.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying.
I'm not saying any of the topics are bad. I'm not saying the shows are bad. I'm not saying any of it is bad. I'm saying it doesn't apply to our world in the same way that it once did.
Right. And not going to be expected to. And in 30 to 40 years, you're going to be in this seat. Somebody already just going to be saying, oh, those terrible shows. Oh, God, that fun home. That horrifying Spring Awakening.
I believe it will.
Because when I was growing up, people would say to me, Florodora, that was a show.
The more you read about musical theater, the more you understand that every year since the beginning of time, everyone's always been like, this is the worst time ever. It was back then that was great. Like,
Right,
it's
of
just,
course.
it's always been the fact
But the
that people
80s
Never started with the intermission talk, you know, that's
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Romeo and
yeah.
Juliet, I mean, you know, the theater is dying, the theater is dying, the theater is practically dead. Someone every day writes, there are no more playwrights, the theater is sick in the head. So, and that was 1953,
Right.
you know, we're still here, you know, so,
Right, so what are we saying is the beginning? If we're saying the 80s is kind of this void of the British
They took out the choreographer, Tony. I'm like,
I also can't
I mean-
avoid the fact that so much of this was about the AIDS crisis and the fact that we're finally getting artists who grew up loving musical theater and who, like, we lost a whole generation, and not just the people we know about, like the Michael Bennett's and the Howard Ashtons. We lost all those people that we never got to know because that happened. And I think that's a huge part of why there was that gap.
but of course the 80s still gave us Blackout, gave us Merrily, gave us Dreamgirls, gave us Nine, gave us Sunday in the Park with George, gave us
Woods.
Into the Woods, you know.
And not just that, but the idea of the mega musical, which of course musicals had run for a long time, but it was like a lot of those shows started in the 80s.
Well, that's what I was saying, the British invasion is really the 80s, right? I mean,
Oh,
we're
yeah.
talking about that.
Oh, yeah.
And so, nothing good out of that?
oh, I wouldn't say that at all, but one thing that also happened in the 80s, something that I'll be very controversial about, somehow musical theater was getting this reputation as being a gay art form, and that turned out to be a problem for a lot of the public too, because there's 90% of the public, we're told, isn't gay, and as a result, a lot of people resisted because they didn't want to be associated with that element, like it or not.
Now, was that coinciding with the AIDS crisis, you mean?
Some of it, but there's an episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show where Mary is going over this guy, who whenever they get in the car, he turns on the radio or the cassette player, and it drives her crazy. So anyway, she comes home from a date, there's Phyllis, if you remember these characters. Anyway, he did it again. We got in the car, he turned on the cassette player. Immediately, he doesn't talk to me. And Phyllis said, what was he playing? And she says, Man of La Mancha. This is the point. I'm expecting the audience to go, oh, meaning if he likes Man of La Mancha, therefore he's gay, and that's why he's not talking to her, and that's why they're not. No, that's not what's happening at all. Still in the 70s, it was not thought of as a gay medium. Somehow that got picked up, and I think it's really hurt the medium as well. Again, none of this has to do with my feelings about homosexuality, not at all. All I'm saying is any business that seems to be alive with 10% of the population is missing out on a lot of potential ticket buyers. I do believe one of the reasons Rocky failed had to do with the fact that a lot of men just didn't want to go to the theater to see music. I'm not saying I'm right.
Now, what's happening with Hamilton? Are men
I think,
in
well,
equal numbers coming?
I don't disagree with that, like what was happening, but I don't think that that's not the case anymore. I think that two things have happened. A, like America has changed, and you know we're nowhere near where we need to be, but it's obviously gone in the right direction of like widely accepted, you know, all kinds
the
of
worst
people
is over.
accepted.
The worst is
but,
over.
And so even if it was considered a gay thing, people would be more okay with that. People love watching Neil Patrick Harris and Jesse Tyler Ferguson and these mainstream openly gay artists in the
On
world of
television.
theater and
God bless
television, all of
Willie
that.
Grace.
God bless Willie Grace. All of that's happening. But also I think that there have been all of these shows that have called back to the, you used to, and this is another big part of I think the golden age that people, I mean we all know about it, but it's like New York changed and there was this tired businessman, right, who was like the regular theater goer, and there was like the garment industry. There were all these New Yorkers, these types of people who went to Broadway, and then those people did not live in Manhattan anymore, and as a result, it became more of a tourist industry, it became more of the gay industry. It was all of those things kind of happening at
Yeah, I
once.
just wrote a statistic that said in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 70% of the Broadway audience was
New
New
Yorkers,
Yorkers,
yeah.
30% was out of towners, and it's exactly the opposite.
New York.
So 70% of ticket buyers are out of towners.
And a lot of it was the city in the 80s was in the dumps,
Right.
and that affects Broadway hugely. And, you know, the kinds of tourists that wanted to come to New York were, I mean, it was all of those things happening at once, but now it's certain, I don't find it to be like that anymore. And then from, you know, Spamalot to Book of Mormon, there's all these shows where straight people or people who are not, you know, don't understand gay art or whatever it is, go, oh, that's for me. And then hopefully once you get them in the theater, they see that it's for everyone and that, you know.
Which can help explain a little bit about there's so many film to stage transfers, because the film titles are recognizable to the general public, not necessarily associated with any particular artist.
I don't mind when a film is adapted into a musical. I don't like when film musical is adapted on stage, because they always kill in comparison. Because you don't have Gene Kelly, you don't have Fred Astaire, you don't have those people, and you're just reminded of it so much. But a lot of people take issue with the fact that movies are now the fodder for musicals. And I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. It's fine
Well,
with
it's the
me.
same as rock and roll, that's the vernacular.
Yeah, I think the problem is most people adapt movies badly for the musical stage. And I think the problem is they take the screenplay and they stick songs in
I'm
it
afraid so.
instead of completely
I'm afraid so.
restructuring.
Yes.
Okay, so then now we're talking about storytelling and what are the important things about storytelling. And so it seems like some of the conventions from the Golden Age are carry over to make successful current Golden Age shows. For instance, you know, a protagonist who has a huge need or a huge want that's defined immediately, and then the whole show kind of centers around that. And Hamilton could be a more perfect example of that. So some things of those conventions of the old are really carried over. It just with different music.
I have a theory on this.
Yes.
I blog about our company's creative process. We put on shows, but in between shows, I blog about the art form. And I've decided, myself, that there are two new forms right now. There is the neo-musical comedy and the neo-rock musical. And the neo-musical comedy uses all the conventions of classic musical comedy, but for much darker, much more political, much more ironic purposes. Like Andrew Jackson, Alyssa Strott Jones, Hairspray, et cetera, et cetera. And
Two of those are failures.
yeah, but I produce all the failures.
And they're actually successful.
And also, as we've talked about today, like failure is a relative term.
Yeah.
Not in those two shows. They've closed really quickly.
On Broadway, but failure means, like, what does
Yeah,
failure
produced all
mean?
over the country.
If people love them and are doing them all over the world. Like, that's what we've been talking about today. If once a show leaves Broadway and isn't necessarily successful, we were talking about Seussical and how that was a failure on Broadway, but now it's being
One
done
of the most
everywhere.
British shows.
Well, so the other half of my theory is the neo-rock musical takes all the conventions of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical and translates it both in content and in musical form. So I do think there are tons of conventions from
that are
the old Golden Age that are being repurposed
Right.
now.
Right.
I think
Well,
it's
the
a huge way.
variation on the thing, there are only 7 plots, or whatever that statement is, I mean,
Yeah.
it fits in that dynamic.
But what about things like the I Want song,
That's
you
also
know,
another
all these
thing.
things, those are still relevant.
Right.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
not, in fact, it's hard to find a show that's successful that doesn't have those things.
The best received musicals of the last 20 years, you can see use all of those conventions and then are also doing all of this new stuff.
Right.
I remember reading a lot about how the Book of Mormon creators looked at the Disney musicals. And it's like, there's those conventions and then you see how you can differ from them and just talk about what's going on today.
And I bet the Disney musicals they were looking at were the ones that Howard Ashman.
Yeah.
And he brought from the musical theater into the Disney, you know, the songwriting techniques
Right.
of the Broadway musical. And gave them the lecture. Have you seen that lecture that Howard has gave the Disney folks when he was hired to do The Little Mermaid? It's on that video about the whole Disney animation revolution. What's the name of that? Huh? Waking Sleep. Thank you, my daughter. Waking Sleeping Beauty, and it's an extra actually on that DVD. It's an 11-minute speech that Howard gave to the whole Disney animation thing about the I Want song and you know how you structure a musical and how that has to be done in the animation to be successful. And they bought it, let it sinker, thank God, and that's the reason some of those are successful.
And animation distribution's a big part of the new golden age too, because when you look at something like Frozen, and if millions of people are loving Frozen, they're gonna wanna see a stage musical, because
Right.
Frozen is essentially using a lot of those same forms.
Right now, they're gonna take that and they're gonna expand it, and they're gonna write a whole bunch of more songs, right? Good or bad, 'cause this is kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about.
Well, this
taking
brings
it
up
up, having a musical already on film and then bringing it.
This brings up something we were talking about in the car. You have to understand, I go to the theater literally 350 times a year, maybe more. And as a result, I see no movies. I mean, there's no time. You know? So as a result, I had never seen The Little Mermaid until the Broadway production was happening. And I thought, all right, let me watch the movie. And I always do this. I mean, I'm going to be watching Waitress next week and American Psycho next week before I go to see the show. So anyway, I watched The Little Mermaid, and I am telling you, I am so emotionally involved with this girl losing her voice. I couldn't believe it. I was so upset about the fact that she was losing her voice. I mean this, I had to turn it off. Wow! Too much for me.
It's a really good movie.
It's a great.
I understand. The next time I went to see the Broadway show, there's a real human being up there, and I felt nothing for her whatsoever. It was so interesting to me that I get so invested in the animated character and not in the human being. Something was wrong there. It just didn't
I think
translate.
it's hard. I think it's hard to take those and put them on stage. I mean, that one was obviously not a success. Beauty and the Beast was a huge success. Lion King was a gigantic success.
Sure. That, of course, resembles the movie not at all.
Right. Right. And so I think maybe
But I also, like, separate from the movie to stage adaptations, I mean, there are also people that are gonna be, like, 12-year-old girls watching Frozen who go, Mommy, we're going to New York, I wanna see a show, and maybe that's not Frozen. Like, I think there's a lot of that happening in 2016 that's bringing, I mean, Broadway is healthier than it's been in decades. It's all these people that are seeing, and, you know, more people saw one episode of Smash than saw Lion King in a year. So even something that's a failure on TV that has musical theater is reaching all these people, and I think that's creating new audiences.
And there is a future for your show.
I think that's like a reality show on Bravo.
Bravo, exactly.
Okay, connected to that, we have 20-somethings all over the country starting theater companies. And they're all doing the kind of stuff I'm doing, like Andrew Jackson next to Normal, et cetera, et cetera. And that's amazing. So all these people all over the country are seeing these shows that died on Broadway.
Right, and like the millennial Facebook culture says like, hey, I like this thing I saw, let's do it and just make a video and show everyone. And that creates this whole new world for like everyone to do musical theater of their own.
And it doesn't matter that it was a failure on Broadway.
No.
It does not matter. For I'm talking about these folks that just decide, I'm going to do this.
But it doesn't matter that it was on Broadway.
Yeah.
As much as I don't like it,
But you can say-
I'll sell well, way better if the press release says Broadway musical, not Bloody Bloody
And there are musicals that are hits on Broadway that no one remembers, and musicals that are flops on Broadway that are remembered because of how they've lived on. So it's just relative.
That's the term lived on, because, you know, even though you're talking about Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, Mrs. Strata Jones, let's see what happens in a few years. Let's see if they're still doing them.
Well, this Strata is so hard to do, I don't think it's going to have that many productions.
Okay, but I mean, like, Seussical certainly benefited from the fact that it was Dr. Seuss, and people had interest in that. And of course, that was not a failure in the long run, but we needed the long run to see it. Suddenly, it's been 16 years since Seussical, and it's had time for that history to happen. I'm not sure that we're going to see Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson and Mrs. Strata Jones in 16 years. You don't think we
No,
will?
well, Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson is so hard for an audience to get through. I mean, it's a really aggressive, ugly story, and it's a select audience that loves that kind of thing. So I don't think it will. We'll be talking about it.
And I've not really heard about this Strata being done, really.
I think every once in a while, I see on Facebook somebody's doing a production of it, but you know, they have to have such a specialized cast that can play basketball.
Basketball.
You know.
On basketball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's not really a way around that. So, let's go back. You said the first golden age goes all the way up to 81. maybe.
Yeah, I would say that.
And then we have this void, and then when do we kick back in after?
Well, it's a little unfair to just whitewash the 80s, because there were three major hits in the 80s, two of which you can see on Broadway today. Because, you know, Cats was an amazing success, to say the least. It became the longest running show in Broadway history for a long time. And, you know, it beat Chorus Line, and you could really feel the resentment, not just because it was a British musical, but because Chorus Line is considered a far greater quality And there was such relief in Chorus Line outran Grease to become the longest running show in Broadway history, because, you know, Grease is fun and God love it, you know, no problem, but I mean, you know, we like to think of, you know, the longest running show as really being of great quality. And of course now, you know, we have Phantom, which will probably never be surpassed, because I'm told Andrew Lloyd Webber just will not allow that to close, that he buys a lot of seats every week so that.
We better censor this.
I never say what I say is true, I only tell you what I hear. So anyway, but I mean, those shows were significant, and they really deserve the credit for getting people at least somewhat interested. I mean, obviously, a show doesn't run 15 years, which Cats did, without, you know, having some sort of interest behind it. So those three shows did make a tremendous difference, and as I say, two of them are still there. Granted, like it's a big event, you know, but to think that this is the second revival already of Les Mis, and you know, both of those revivals lasted a decent amount of time for revivals. So, but I guess there was some sort of feeling that a lot of people did resent the fact that they were British, and that's too bad, you know, because wherever it comes, I don't care where shows come from as long as they go. That has no bearing on my interest whatsoever.
Well, Evita was one of the shows that I saw in my high school summer trips to New York. And that's like 79, so right at the tail end,
Yeah.
right at the beginning of the
Right.
decade. And I thought there couldn't have been anything greater in the world than that show. And so I didn't really have the problem with the Cats, okay. But yeah, I didn't really have the problem.
Well,
It's all part of the mix of what was on Broadway.
I mean, part of it is I kind of feel like we didn't really move forward in the 80s. You know, we had a couple really cool Sondheim things, but we didn't really move, and we didn't go anywhere. And then early 90s, we got Assassins. Mid 90s, we got so much cool stuff.
Well,
I felt like we're moving forward.
I don't know, Scott, from the vantage point of the fact that we had musicals that didn't have books anymore, per se. Yeah, Cats won for Best Book, Tony, you know, even though Ronnie's dead and never worked on it. But the thing is, you know, I mean, the Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice were saying, we don't need books anymore, and they influenced people in that regard.
Well,
That
yeah,
was-
because that movie forward.
Well, I think given the fact that they've done so well, those British musicals, I think we have to concede they had something, or even
Well, we had some through musicals already.
Well, it did what we were talking about earlier about, you know, magazines and Ned Sullivan. It brought awareness of the Broadway stage to mass population.
But there's also types of musicals like those musicals that have, like, look at jukebox musicals. There have been like a bunch of big hits and some flops, and then things take on the attributes of the hits and figure out how to make their own thing. And now we have this whole other genre. Does that mean that the jukebox musicals, you know, come with a golden age? Like, I don't think so. And I think, you know, my favorite musicals from the 80s, my second two favorite musicals are from the 70s. I still think the golden age is 43 to 69 because of all of those things converging that I talked about. But I think that so many good things happened in the 70s and 80s, but I agree with you that the art form didn't start getting moved forward again until the new golden age, which is also hard to pinpoint because we're in it. Like, perspective is hard to come by when you're in the trenches.
But if you were pressed, what are a couple of shows in the 90s that you think are the harbinger of a new cool?
Rent, Violet, Noise Funk, Floyd
So
Collins.
96, nothing, I mean. what
Avenue
about-
X.
Okay.
Bad
Wow.
Boy, Eurotown.
wow, Avenue X.
Oh, I thought that was amazing.
No, that may be, but does anybody know what he's talking about? This is not Avenue Q.
Yeah, to be honest, I only know it because Repertory Theater St. Louis did it, so I got to see it in St. Louis.
And I don't know, I don't think we can really pin much success on the American Theater on Avenue X, which,
Yeah, but I'm not concerned with
You're-
commercial
we're
success.
talking about-
Sure. I'm talking about is the art form.
I
Doing
know,
something more
but-
interesting.
Yeah, we're literally talking about two different things.
but true, wait, but how is Avenue X something that really has affected anything? I can think of one a cappella musical since then, which hasn't done that well.
And to me, it tackled race in a much more serious way than almost any other shows.
I have an answer to that too, but would be videotaped, so we'll talk about
Well,
that.
so, but were enough people aware of Avenue X for it to have an influence on?
I'm not saying it had an influence. I'm saying that it was one of
You're just
the
saying
amazing
has-
things that was happening
Okay,
suddenly
okay,
at this moment.
okay.
And all these amazing, because, you know, I'm not sure Noise Funk necessarily had effect on their shows.
Yeah.
And maybe not Violet, but it was suddenly this amazing work being done that was really not like Well, yeah, we're already saying, you know.
I think that, like, from talking to musical theater writers and directors and people who are creating now and are part of this new golden age, I don't think it started in the 90s, but I think that Rent happened, and Rent affected a generation of artists who said, I can be any race, I can be any sexuality, I can write a rock musical, musicals are cool again. It started all of, young people are going to the theater, New York is happening new things. Like, it started all of these things that I think then, like maybe about 2004, and I'm considering the golden age based on when people started paying attention to Broadway in the larger world, and you have these phenomenons like Wicked and Avenue Q, which I would consider part
Well,
of
what
that.
about the Disney, like the stage version of Beauty and the Beast? Or Lion
I think all of these things, like all of that time, I'm like Beauty and the Beast, like Dreamgirls, the Cats, Phantom, all those things were happening. They were phenomenons, there were hits. But I think that the new golden age starts when people start paying attention to Broadway in a real way with like the mid 2000s, and maybe not even that, maybe like more recent. I don't think it's going to be really possible to pinpoint until we're out of it.
Well, one of the things I think made Rent successful, and God bless it, it's I think one of the most valuable things, that suddenly young people are not being treated as second-class citizens in the second balcony.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of letting them sit in the first 2 rows made a tremendous difference, because of my generation, many of us, you know, when I saw Follies, it was through the second balcony. You know, so that's a tremendous thing. One has to wonder if indeed Rent would have been as successful as it was if indeed Jonathan hadn't died. You have to wonder that. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying yes or no, but the media frenzy about that happening was really something at the time, and really helped that to be front page news.
I think one of the things that's interesting is that you guys live in New York, and you're talking about Broadway, and I'm talking about musical theater.
It's so interesting.
And so to me, Violet and Avenue X and all that was these wonderful little presents in the art form, and I was like, my God, the art form is going these wonderful places. But you guys are saying, yeah, but nobody's going in New York to see these things, and that, you know,
I
it's
think
like
that. I think all of those things push the art form forward. I agree with you on that. And I think that when I consider pushing the art form forward, that's not what I consider to define a golden age. Like I'm defining a golden age as when the world is paying attention to Broadway. And I agree with you.
I agree with
on all
that.
of those
I
things.
know that's what you've been saying,
Yeah.
there's no question. But let's talk about something else here. One of the reasons that Rock of Ages was so successful is because people went to see it and said, oh, weren't we silly then? All right. Now, in the 80s, they didn't think they were silly at all. Is it possible that some of the shows we're talking about here that you really think are so groundbreaking and so important? It's a question I asked earlier, but I'll ask it in a different form. You know, what will happen to these as time goes on? Will indeed they have the same impact? And I think that's something, I won't live to see it, you guys will, but it will be very interesting if there is a heaven and a God. I will certainly like looking down and seeing what's going on there.
and we'll probably be surprised by which ones
I think we
survive.
will. I think we will. Let's take a few questions from the folks out here. Any thoughts, questions?
Anybody?
Your own opinions are very
I got
valuable.
questions.
Yes?
I'm the elder here, I believe. Now, when I grew up, there were 78 records and they were albums, folks. And you had 6 or 7 records in there for the whole Broadway musical.
Right.
I could, by the time I was 10, I could sing them. I knew the words and the music. They were musical. Now, is Rent and Rock of Ages, are people singing them when they're washing their animals?
I have an
Rent,
answer.
yes.
I have an answer to that. There's a wonderful thing every year in Atlanta called the Junior Theater Festival, which has middle school kids coming and performing in Atlanta, Georgia. They do 15-minute excerpts of musical. That's it, 15 minutes. They all come down there. And there's a gift shop. So anyway, I walked into the gift shop, and the woman's running the gift shop saying to me, the Hamilton stuff is just flying off the shelves. I mean, you just cannot keep up with it. She says, you know, because every kid knows Hamilton chapter and verse. And I said, well, you know, the album's only been out a couple of weeks. I don't imagine they know it. She just pulled 2 kids at random and said, sing a song from Hamilton. Kaboom!
That's what I want.
Yeah, I mean, you know.
Well, and Rock of Ages uses songs from the 80s, rock songs from the 80s. So those songs are already in the consciousness of
Yeah, their
people that-
grandfather was.
Yeah.
I guess the show was so loud when I saw it on Broadway.
Yeah.
I had to have both of my ears, I had
Yes,
things in there.
yes.
And I think it spoiled the show for me. It
Well,
was so loud,
yeah.
and so,
I think like a good sound designer can make all the difference in whether different generations can respond to a rock show or any kind of show. I mean, I have seen rock shows that I've been like, this does not work, and it's because I can't hear the lyrics. I don't find the songs dramatically successful, and it's because maybe it's because they don't rhyme. I think there are people who saw Rent on Broadway, which I think is a genius work, and who didn't think it worked because at certain points they had sound problems,
Yeah,
like in that
it
theater.
was.
I think that is a huge part of it, and as we have more rock musicals, there are some very smart sound designers out there who figure out how to help us hear the lyrics, and that's made all the difference.
I'll never forget when I saw Mamma Mia in 2001, and the first act ended its intermission, and now it's time for it to start again. And I'm telling you, the sound was so loud that people jumped up like they were electrocuted.
Are there songs in Rent that you can sit right there and sing the thing?
Oh, yeah.
See, I think that's a generational thing, I think.
Well, it's just what you listen to over and over again. You just
Yeah,
learn.
Sondheim always said, a hummable song is something you listen to over and over. Sure. Yeah, it is. If you're interested in it, you listen to it, it will become singable.
Can I just say, we just closed production of American Idiot in St. Louis, which is punk rock. And my sound designer said to me, now you know this has to be much louder than anything else. We only do rock musicals, but he's like, much louder, and like, as long as I can understand the lyrics, you make it as loud as you want. And so it was absolutely the loudest show we've ever done, but nobody complained about it because you could hear every lyric. And I think if you do clarity, the lyrics not as bad.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you came on way back to like Backboy and shows, the early 2000 shows. For my generation, I guess the people, not necessarily people, but for me, to relate, I had the conversation in class today, that 9/11 is the equality to the AIDS epidemic. And you keep on going back to Backboy, and I did Backboy sophomore year in high school. And we talked, and Dave Clemens came and talked to us about how after 9/11, no one wanted to go downtown and see theater. And for a couple years, you talked about how just recently it's come back, like how it's relevant in popular culture more so. What do you think the effect that we still see of that and that? I mean, Hamilton, Book of Mormon, the ones that come to my mind, Book of Mormon is the first one in a long time since for me at least, Rent, that is a commercial, that big of a commercial success that everyone's talking about. I have friends. I'm from Florida. I have friends.
I'm in Florida.
I live in Tampa, Florida.
Yeah.
I just spent 6 weeks there.
Thank you. That I have friends who I've done music theater all my life and who were never really appreciated the art form, and then they would go to New York and they saw Book of Mormon, but I don't think any of the shows early. What show?
Wicked did
Wicked.
that.
Wicked. Okay. So I guess
I would say
that.
Yeah, I'd say Wicked and Avenue Q of that season
Yeah.
were pretty.
I'll tell you, 9/11, that was a Tuesday, and the shows didn't start again until Thursday. And I purposely went and, I didn't even ask the press office for free tickets. I just went and bought a ticket to the Music Man because I thought this is an all-American show. I want to see what's going to happen here. Are people going to break down when you hear you got trouble right here in River City? I mean, I was wondering about that, and I would say there were probably 200 people in the house. The place was empty because people were still petrified of coming into New York City. I happen to live 4 streets away from the theater, so I'm fine. But, and by the way, that's 52nd Street where it was playing, and that was the first night you could really smell burning smell. We did come uptown from it was about 70 streets or so. It took a while. But anyway, it was so fascinating to see that company act as if this were a happy time on Earth, and then afterwards, because I knew 3 people in the cast, I waited at the stage door, and watching those actors come out in tears, that they were able to put it away for 2 hours, but then they became themselves after they got out of their Iowa mentalities, and they were just devastated. And I remember, I talked to Rebecca Luca, who was the leading lady playing Mary, and John Sloman, who was one of the 4 barbershop quartet guys. And I don't remember who said what, but I remember one of them said, we should have never started so soon. This is just terrible. Well, the other one said, thank God we started, because we just had to get our minds off. How many times can you watch that stuff on TV, the buildings coming down? So I know that doesn't quite answer your question about 9/11, but I did want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fascinating about the music band.
No,
No, go ahead. But to answer your question, I think what's really fascinating is that immediately 9/11 happened, and then the next hits that happened were Hairspray happened, and there were the producers kept running, and like a couple years right after, we had the season where it was like Spamalot and Spelling Bee and these hits, and they were all fun, and they were all happy, and people wanted to go see Mamma Mia, and I don't think if Spring Awakening had happened the year after, it would even have been the amount of successful that it was, and I think that it took a while for us to get back to the difficult, challenging musical plays, because people
Which is
wanted to
not
escape
unlike
it.
the 30s, 3 years.
Exactly. It's the same
Yeah.
thing.
Folks, we have to call it right now, but we can continue if you want to talk to these folks. We'll go out in the hallway. They have a show to get ready for tonight. So we don't want to keep delay them any further. Please give them a round of applause. And Fuse will be doing a production of My Fair Lady right there on the stage this summer. So you can say June, a couple weekends in June. Thank you. Thanks again. Great.